right, so I had to get a little creative and propping this phone up to do this lesson because my little phone propper thing has gone. Whew, it's been a long teaching day. My hair is a hot mess, but don't judge me. Anyways, so today's lesson is going to be on benchmark fractions or benchmark percents. So I know you guys have heard of benchmark fractions, or maybe you don't remember, but you did learn them in elementary school. Like benchmark fractions, like obviously you have 0, you have 1 whole, and then like a half was like a benchmark fraction. So you could use benchmark fractions to determine what fractions were greater than or less than. You could use them to order them. You can use them all types of various ways. So we're going to do the same thing with percents, because fractions can be written as decimals, and decimals can be written as percents, and percents can be written as fractions. So kind of fractions, decimals, and percents kind of all go together. So if we can use benchmark fractions with fractions, then we can use them with percents. So I'm going to kind of go over that. Hopefully this phone doesn't continue to slide. It's going to continue to slide down the chair. So I'll just have to keep checking it and make sure it's not sliding down to the point where you can't see me. Anyways, so lesson 2, using estimation and benchmark percents. So obviously the key term is benchmark percents. So benchmark, it's just like, kind of like a milestone, you know? So it's just like a mile marker. It's not like each individual tiniest possible percent possible. It's just the big ones that we can use, we can easily figure out to kind of determine like percents of, like the actual percent of something. So we're going to order fraction, decimals, and percents. We're going to use benchmark percents to calculate common percents of quantities, and we're going to estimate percents using benchmarks. So, did that thing slide? No, I think we're good. We're good. Okay. I'm trying to make this video like as quick as possible. I don't want you guys having to spend too much time listening to me. I know how you guys like to speed me up. Anyways, here we have 1/10 times 350. And if you guys remember your elementary school skills, that when you multiply by a fraction, this number will get, the answer will actually get smaller. Typically when we multiply by whole numbers, our product is usually greater than our factors. But when one of our factors is a fraction or a number less than 1, then the opposite thing occurs. So plus it has this denominator of 10, meaning that if it's going to get smaller and it has a denominator of 10, meaning it is a power of 10, all we have to do is move the decimal. Where is the decimal? If we're taking 1/10 of 350, where is the decimal? Well, there's always an invisible decimal after the ones place, so it's right there. And if we know it's going to get smaller, we have to move our decimal. This thing is sliding down, isn't it? We have to move that decimal 1 place value to the right? No, to the left, because it's getting smaller. So that means that in 350, our decimal is here. We want to take 1/10 of it. It's 1 power of 10, meaning it should be this, okay? The next problem is multiplying by 1/100th, which is 2 powers of 10, getting smaller, meaning this is getting smaller because it's multiplying by a number less than 1. This is 2 powers of 10 because it's 100th, meaning that if we have 350, we know our decimal is after the ones place. It needs to move 2 to the left because it should get smaller. Therefore, the answer would be 3.5. It would end up right here. 1 to the left is 1 power of 10. It's right here. It should move to there. Let me box this one in. And this is 2 powers of 10. So the decimal is after the ones place. We move it 2. So it would end up in between the 6 and the 7. Notice I put the 0 here and I didn't put the 0 there, but that really doesn't matter. So let's look at these benchmark fractions and let's keep this. Why does the phone keep sliding? All right. Going to activity 1, we're skipping 272 and jumping to activity 1, and here are your benchmark fractions. They look just like fraction bars, or benchmark percents, I should say. So this fraction bar, 100%, matches the fraction of 1 whole. So this is the same as 1 whole. And these two fraction bars that say 50% are the same size as the half size fraction bars. So these are the same as a half. And these are the same as 1/4 size. These are the same as 1/5 size. And then these down here, obviously the same as the 1/10 size. So these are your benchmark percents. Honestly, the big ones are 50%, because you just take half of it. 50% is half. 50% is half. And your 10%, because your 10% is the same as a 10th, which is a power of 10. So if you're finding 10% of something, you're multiplying it by a 10th, meaning you just move your decimal point one place value to the left, like we just did in the warm-up. So it says, how is 50% related to 100%? Well, 50% is half of 100%. Here's this word of, meaning multiply by half. How is 25% related to 100%? Is that thing sliding again? Looks like it's sliding. This is going to be a fun video, y'all. Okay. Well, 25% is 1/4 of 100%. And 25% is half of 50%. Okay? And then 10% is a 1/10 of 100%, right? So 10% is 1/10 of 100%. But 10%, if we look at 50% through here, so here's this line through the middle, 10% is 1/5 of 50, because you need 5 of them to make 50%. So 10% is 1/5 of 50%. So it's 1 of the 5 needed to make 50%. So that's why a 1/10 is only 1/5 of 50%. All right, so those are your major benchmarks, okay? Now let's look at maybe some problems or how do we use these benchmarks. So how is 5% related to 10%? Well, 5% is half of 10%, because 5 is half of 10. And how is 1% related to 10%? Well, 1%, you need 10 of them to make 10%. So it is 1/10 of 10%. Well, how is it related to 5%? Well, how many of these do you need to make 5%? You need 5 of them. So 1 is 1/5 of 5%, okay? Down here, we're going to use these benchmarks to determine each one for the number 600, okay? So our number is 600, and we know if we have set all 600, we have 100%. So it's like, well, what if we only have 50%? What's half of 300? 50% is half of 100%, so what's half of 600? Half of 600 is 300. What about a quarter? Well, I know 25% is half of 50. If 50% is 300, 25% is half of this, so the answer will be half of 300, which is 150. Okay? 10% is 1/10 of 100%. So I want to know, what is 1/10 of 600? 1/10 of means 1/10 times. And here is that power of 10 that we're multiplying by, which means we take that decimal and move it one place value to the left. So the answer is, don't put that little thing, that circle there. All right, 5% is half of 10%. That means whatever 5% is half of 60. And what's half of 60? 30. Okay? And I know 1% is a tenth of 10%, right? 1%, we set it up here. 1% is a tenth of 10%. You need 10 of them to make 10%. So 1 is a tenth of them. So I know that 1% of 600 would be a tenth of the 10%. A tenth of 60, which means I just move the decimal. So it would be 6. All right. Now it says down here, it says use your calculator to determine each of these, okay? So how would I write 1% as a fraction? Here's something that y'all should know. 1% of a fraction. 1% is literally 1 over 100, okay? 1% is 1 over 100. So if I get my handy dandy calculator, I'm just going to take 1/100th of 28. This word of means to multiply. So I'm going to multiply 28 times 100th. What is 100th as a decimal? 0.01. So in your calculator, you just punch that in. 0.01 times 28, and you get 0.28. And honestly, you should know this, that 1% is 100. That is 2 powers of 10. So if I have the number 28, and I am multiplying by a power of 10, okay, if I'm multiplying by 2 powers of 10, which is 100, this is 100th, so my decimal will be moving to the left because it's less than 1. And all you got to do is think, okay, I'm finding it of 28. Well, there's 28. There's my decimal. That is 2 powers of 10. It should shift to here. So that answer makes sense. I put it in my calculator, I get that, but I can also do it without a calculator so easily. All right, so again, this is 100th. 2 powers of 10, shift it 2. It should be 2.34. Let's put it in the calculator and see what happens. So I'm going to do times 234, 2.34. Look at that. I don't really need the calculator because I understand my skill. Again, 100th. 2 to the left. 1, I got to add a 0. So it should be 0.0085. Let's see if that happens. And it does. Again, 100th. 1% is 100th. So it should be 0.0586. Boom. Getting them right every time. Now in 10% is the same as 10 over 100. Right? 10% is 10 over 100, which is the same as 1/10. So if I'm finding a tenth of 28, a tenth is the same thing as 0.1, 1/10. But we're also, this is a power of 10, guys. 1 power of 10, meaning I'm only moving the decimal once. So it should be 2.8. And if I take 0.1 times 28, I get that 2.8. Shifting it once because it's 10%, which is the same as a tenth. So it should be 23.4. This should be 0.085, and this should be 0.586. So 10%, guys. 1% is 2 place values. You move the decimal to the left. 10% is 1 place value, 1 to the left, which makes sense. All right. So let's go with page 275. Basically goes over the same thing we just did on that page. So we're going to go ahead and move to 276. And 276 says determining, let's move this down so you can see it. Let's make sure my phone isn't sliding because it probably is. This is determining percents using benchmarks. One way that people use percents in the real world is to decide how much tip to leave in a server in a restaurant. This is a real life skill. The going tip rate most times is 20% these days. Used to be 10%. Now we leave 20%. But 20% is to 10%. Just saying. It says a Kuro eats at the Eat and Talk restaurant and decides to leave a 15% tip. That's not 10% or 20%. I don't know what to think about a Kuro here. A Kuro says I can easily calculate 10% of any number and then calculate half of that, which is 5%. And he's right. So if I get 10% and then I take half of it and then add it to the 10%, so I take the 10% and the 5%, put them together, I get 15%, and then I have my 15% tip. So easy, because 10% plus 5% is 15%, I'm pretty sure. I mean, I'm not no math whiz, actually I am. But 10% plus 5%, sure enough, is 15%, okay? So if he had a $16 bill, I'm going to go ahead and write it as just 16. And I want to know 15%. I'm going to take 10% because that's the easy one. That thing slid again. I'm going to take 10%. Then I'm going to find the 5% because that's just half of the 10% I found. And then put those two numbers together and I'll get my 15%, right? So 10% of 16 would be 1/10 times 16. That's only moving that decimal 1 to the left. It should be getting smaller. It's 1 power of 10. So it's here. It should move to there. So it would be 1.6. Okay? So 1.6 is a 10%. You're like, well, 5% is half of this. Well, half of 1.6, it's 16. Half of 16 is 8. So half of 1.6 would be 0.8. So if 5% is half of 10%, then what is half of 1.6? Well, 0.8. So if my 10% is this, my 5% is this, I add them together, and my tip would be $2.40. Did it slide again? Man, this is going to be interesting, isn't it? All right. So, and you can do that with just about any number. Like 24, okay? Half of 24 is 12. So 10% would be, move it once. So 10% would be 2.4. And then the 5% would be half of this, which is 1.2. You put them together, you get $3.60. Here, this is an ugly one. 10%, move the decimal once, so it's 3.256. And then 5% is half of this. Well, I'm just going to use my calculator because that is a crazy number. So if I'm finding half of something, I just divide it by 2. 1.628. And then I put these two together. Let me line them up better. It's not lined up very well right there. There you go. There's your tip. You really wouldn't want this thousandths place value, so you would round it. So the answer would really be $4.88. So, anyways, that's how that works. Okay. Also, it says over here on the next page, you can determine any whole percent of a number by using 10%, 5%, and 1%. Those are like the big benchmark ones. 50%, obviously, it's just half of whatever your value is. And then 10% is a tenth of it. 5% is half of 10. 1% is 100th of the whole, so you would move it 2. It's also a 1/10 of a 10. So you can use these various benchmark percents to kind of help you out. But I'm not going to go through this page. I think you guys get the gist of it. We'll do a lot of practice with Delta Math, working with that 10% trick, because really it's the 10% trick. If you can find 10%, you can find 5%. If you can find 10%, you can find 1%. If you can find 10%, you can find 20%. You can find 25%. You can find anything. If you figure out your 10%, your 1%, you can kind of go from there. You just kind of got to add stuff together and you can get your answer. So, but like I said, we're going to do a lot of practice with this in class. We're going to use other methods as well. This is just a quick trick that you can kind of like do this math in your head. I do a lot of my tip calculating in my head when I'm at a restaurant, or like when I'm looking at sales and things like that. I'm able to kind of guesstimate really close to what I'm going to be paying if things are on sale. And what my tip or my tax or whatever is going to be by just using these tricks. So anyways, hope you enjoyed the video.